preliminary remarks before I hand over to Furkula to make an introductory statement of about 5 minutes. We'll follow on around the rest of the panel, and then we'll open open to the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to agree with Tungo on the Brazilians certainly won the Soccer World Cup because they came to Malaysia. I'm German, so I will have around with my colleagues in Germany. Anyway, I would like to focus on some of the issues that Tungo raised on the back of the Commonwealth Games 1998. I have personally lived in Malaysia now for about 20 years, and most of those years I've in some way or other been involved in sport and sports development, which also, of course, includes components such as sports tourism. And the Commonwealth Games or any large international sporting event is sports tourism in its truest form. I would like to focus, however, on aspects that I think sometimes get a little bit less attention, and that is really the sports development on the back or following on major sporting events. We've had the Commonwealth Games, we had the Formula One, we had the Hockey World Cup, and so many other very prestigious events in Malaysia. But what, as Tunko also addressed this issue, is after the Commonwealth Games and after billions of ringgit of infrastructure development, we have seen underutilization of exactly those facilities that were built for the purpose of sport. And I'm a little bit disappointed in 20 years in Malaysia that what I've seen happening in the last 10 years more than anything else, and it could have been a reason of media, more global TV audiences, of satellite television that we have seen here in Malaysia and elsewhere, is that the Malaysian audience has become spectator. Not so much participants, but spectators. And in my opinion, the hosting of any large international sporting event has to have an impetus, has to give some sort of become a driving force in the development of sports here in Malaysia and any country that hosts such events. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, this is not happening yet. In spite of having, as I said, this large infrastructure development, we have not seen really the grassroots sports development in many disciplines, not just those glorified, such as Formula One, and so we've got our own Formula One driver with sort of varying successes. He participated in the 2002 season. But what has not happened is, especially in athletics, in gymnastics, in swimming and so, that there was a large groundswell, a large support of sports development in Malaysia, starting at the schools, carrying on in sports associations and sports clubs elsewhere. And this is, I think, where a focus has to be established while planning large international sporting events, that there is a follow-on benefit, not just in economics and infrastructure or tourism receipts, but also in the development of sports at the host nation. And this sort of programs could include things like exchange programs with athletes, with coaches, more, as I said, sports development, driving it down to the school level, at the club level, in order to make those sporting events meaningful beyond the economic benefit. This is really where I see a lot of work has to be done, a lot of attention is to be paid in order to sustain a nation's sports and leisure development objectives and strategies, in order not to deteriorate in just becoming a host for spectators around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if Leonard de Vries would like to follow that with some comments.
Hello, yes. Leonard de Vries from Malaysia. I guess I will address this issue of international sports events, mainly from my background in Asia. And the aim of this session is to discuss the values, the benefits, the disadvantages of organizing and hosting international events. In a short while, perhaps what I will do is just pose a few questions. I think that is of interest for me anyway, and for everybody. I think the first one is the relationship between international sports events and I'm taking it the development of elite sport in a country, the development of elite sport in a country. So one has to evaluate international sports events from the development of elite sports, and I guess you would have to think, you would have to look into that issue. But just to help us around in my thinking, if you look at elite sport, the IOC indicates that when you look at the elite sport, there are basically 7 factors, and that is coaches, athletes, facilities, management, finance, competition, and welfare of athletes. So in terms of international sport events, one has to say whether, in fact, the international sport event, has some benefits on the development of elite sport from those perspectives. Very quickly, I think one could say it does have an impact on facilities. I think we develop coaches. I think you go and develop athletes. My main problem here, I think, elite sport, especially in Asia, has very limited development on the management of elite sport. I think it was mentioned, very minimal development of elite sport. And one could take this up. If you look at the Australians Commission of Sport, they look at the factors supporting elite sport besides what the IOC says. So 7 factors, they include information technology, they include research, and they include training centers. I think in most Asian countries, in terms of the ICT, I don't think they develop ICT more for managing the games, but they don't develop ICT to improve sport performance. That's my own view. Research, is this a catalyst for research? I think there's very little research going on in there. So that's one. The other is one would have to look at international sports from the perspective of economic development. We heard about the development of infrastructure. Infrastructure, I think the more linked is economic development from the perspective of tourism. I really believe in Asia we need data to support that. We need data to support the idea about does it in fact bring in tourists in terms of economic. And bringing in tourists, are we talking about bringing in tourists during the phase of the development of the games? Are we talking about bringing in tourists during the games itself, or are we talking about bringing in tourists after the games? What are we talking about? I think since sport and tourism is such a very important issue in most Asian governments, it's terribly important we start getting data on this, whether in fact it does bring in the tourists, I repeat, during the phase of organizing it, at the games itself or after. Just what are we talking about? I just want to deal very quickly with this economic benefits. I think the issue here about the economic benefits on organizing single sports or major sports, to me the main issue here is who funds the sport, who pays for it. Who pays for it? Now, if it's paid by individual organizations, if it's paid by an association, that's fine. You can do it. But you see, if major games are paid by taxpayers, by the government, to me, the main issue here is this, whether the taxpayer, whether the public gets back its returns. To me, that's a very important issue. Of course, today, many people will say, the returns, taxpayers' money for sport, it's long-term and it'll take 20, 30, 100 years to develop. But I think in an economic situation in Asia in which money is scarce, it's these kinds of questions, I think, the transparency is whether the taxpayer gets the money. So in terms of this issue, I think, who funds the games? So one could look at it then from the perspective of economic development. I'm looking at also sport major games from the perspective, since it's basically very often public, one could look at sports, major sports events, from the perspective of sport development, sport for all. Does it in fact provide facilities for people to participate in sport? And that's interesting. I don't want to go into it, but that's a point that you might want to look into. I just want to share with you an experience that I had. I was asked by the Malaysian, I think it was, that was years ago, in 1980 something, when Malaysia organized the SEA Games, and he wanted me to write something for the news, for the Souvenir magazine, and I was thinking about what I should write. And so I decided to write about what it is we expect from the SEA Games. And I don't want to focus on global sports. I didn't want to focus on what people wanted. They want to know from games like this, the success is how much dollars we bring in and how many medals people win, whether we're going to, those are the global standards. So I thought that if we're going to move, then it means that the organizers of the games must establish different criteria for assessing the success of the games. And I tried to identify the success of the SEA Games more from a developmental perspective. I think, and that's what I tried to do. I was listening to this beautiful presentation by Professor Maguire here, and I was trying to recall back on that criteria about a more developmental perspective of major games. I think if we do that, then there might be a chance that people might look at games not only from global standards, like win and losers, how much money we make, but perhaps it could be other facilities being built in different kinds of areas. We look at the number of coaches that will be developed, will the facilities be used by people afterwards, etc., etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, our last speaker and our first two panel members have obviously got a special interest in the impact for Malaysia, particularly of the Commonwealth Games, and we've got a rich theme to strike there with questions. Joe Maguire is going to speak now, although he's obviously had the opportunity to introduce some of the more generic questions in his presentation. But I'll ask Joe if there are any particular points that he wants to pick up in relation to the discussion.
I think just 2 or 3 quick points, really. And I speak as an academic rather than a policy maker, and sometimes, of course, that divide needs to be better linked together in a variety of ways. What I would suggest, though, is that we need to conduct, when we're examining the whole issue of staging and presentation of international sport events, a social audit, if you will, whereby clearly the economics of the hosting of an event needs to be carefully considered, both in terms of costs and benefits. And that may well actually differ in terms of the equation between so-called developed and developing countries. So you need to consider that, I think, as part of the equation. In addition to which, of course, in examining the economics of it, you have to differentiate between that which is, as my colleague just mentioned, that in terms of the global standards, but also the impact on the locality and the people from the communities which are affected by such sport event developments. And that varies from whether it's actually Toronto bidding for the Olympic Games and the cost-benefit analysis of that city, or whether in fact it's an emerging nation. Secondly, there's the political dimension to it. Nations seek to host such international events because of the international prestige which is attached to it. And clearly there's an international pecking order in that regard. I'm not foolish enough to overlook the fact that there is a realpolitik involved in these things, and that nations want their 15 minutes of fame. And again, that equation varies as to whether it's a developed nation seeking to reinforce its status, or whether it's a declining nation wishing to reinvent its traditions, or whether it's an emerging nation wishing to actually assert itself on a global stage. So there's a political dimension to that. I think thirdly, though, is in terms of the social audit one needs to conduct, is the cultural impact. And there, I think, echoing again my colleague's comments, is looking at the extent to which, by so hosting international sport events, whether in an unintended manner, actually one narrows what is available to the populace as a whole, in terms of whether one is focusing and channeling people down a specific body cultural tradition rather than actually embracing diversity. Now, that has been to some extent addressed when specific other body traditions were incorporated into the games, the first time in 1964, for example, with judo, though itself it underwent a process of westernization as a result. It may well be, of course, in the hosting of international events of this kind, one would need to examine then the content as well as the organization. And my final point in these brief comments would be the task I give my own students at the end of a course which I teach on global sport is actually to give them the task of a blank sheet of paper and to start again in re-envisaging what, in fact, major events of this kind would look like. And they find it the most difficult challenge because what we have to do is try to rethink beyond what we presently know and understand. We have to rethink and go beyond the present existing frameworks. So when you ask them for what does such events stand for, how should such events be organized, the timing and pacing of those events, its size and structure, they actually, more often than not, can't think beyond the existing models, which is a 4-yearly event with giganticism as part of its bedrock, rather than actually thinking perhaps locally while acting globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And our final panel member, last but not least, is Derek Casey, who has a wealth of experience in sports administration to draw on, but particularly, I think, has got experience in relation to the Manchester bid for the Commonwealth Games, which has just gone, which I'm sure will have some relation to what he's going to say.
Thank you, Ian. Well, I speak really as a former policymaker and I suppose investor of public money in major events. I think the key message I would like to get across is that major events must be seen not in isolation, but part of an overall strategy. Now, there are several aspects to strategy. It could be to improve volunteerism. It could be to enhance the local public's perception and pride in their city. But I think at the national scale, I think there are 3 elements to this strategy. First of all, some countries, I think, stage major events so that they can improve their international and national recognition, and sometimes reposition themselves on the world stage. And some examples of that might be Korea, 1988 Olympics, when Korea really repositioned itself in world perception, and particularly at the start of the emerging tiger economy. I think of South Africa, who staged the World Rugby Union Cup and then bid for the World Soccer Cup, really trying to reposition the perception of South Africa in the post-apartheid era. I think there are some of the perhaps Middle Eastern countries, places like Dubai, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, who are staging major events such as classic tennis tournaments and classic golf tournaments, such as those high-spending, quality events, really to attract more in terms of sports tourism. And I see the same thing happening in places like the Seychelles and Mauritius and other tourist centres around the world. And at national level, if you look at Melbourne staging 2006 Commonwealth Games, a tremendous tradition of hosting major events, in fact, has a major events unit, similar to attract events to the city, perhaps nationally, because they believe in those, but perhaps also to try and keep out of the shadow of Sydney in terms of the national perception of that particular city. So I think international recognition and repositioning of countries and cities is one part of the strategy. The second reason I think cities, countries host major events is about urban regeneration, where very often the Games provide the excuse or the catalyst for rebuilding parts of the city, or as Jean Hanna said, to develop the infrastructure of the city. And I think examples of that would certainly be Barcelona in 1992, the Olympics there. And for those of you been there recently, the whole development of the coastal strip along the Mediterranean, the harbour area, is very impressive, with the Olympics providing the excuse for that development. Most recently, as Jean has said, in Manchester, a major change to the east end of the city through the staging of the Commonwealth Games. And something like 25 to 30,000 more jobs on a long-term basis arising out of staging the Games in the city and that part of Manchester. In Sydney in 2000, obviously the decision to stage the Games not on Darling Harbour in the centre of the city, but at Holmbush, helped the redevelopment of a fairly derelict area of part of the city. And I suppose all the other ones going back in Munich and Montreal, the development of more Olympic parks for the Olympics refocused the perception of the city and moved the focus of the city away from the city centre into perhaps some of the former suburban areas of those two cities. So urban regeneration is an important element. And the third element of the decision to stage major games, as Kurt has said, is the whole question of sports development. With the major events, the Commonwealth Games, the Olympic Games, provide the target for sports organisations to try to improve the standard of performance and the reputation of the country in terms of high-level sport. And it's really interesting to see that in Korea, for example, from a very poor position on the medals table prior to the Olympics in 1988, Korea suddenly shot up the medal table to a very creditable position. And it's not necessarily always maintained after 1988, but nonetheless one element of a sports development objective. And secondly, in Spain in 1992, Spain did extraordinarily well in the Olympic table because of the long-term investment prior to the Games to improve the standard of performance. And I suppose France also, in terms of soccer and rugby, because of the staging of various world events such as the World Soccer Cup. So ideally for me, Chairman, the staging of a major event brings together three key elements in strategic terms. International recognition, secondly, urban regeneration, and thirdly, sports development. And I suppose where all three have come closest in Olympic terms probably would have been Barcelona in 1992, and perhaps Australia in 2000, although in sports development terms, they were already extremely good, and therefore perhaps that was a lesser element. Where this strategy has not been in place, it's quite interesting to look at cities such as Mexico City, Los Angeles, Moscow, perhaps some of the old sites of the Olympics. It's almost in those countries and those cities as if the circus came to town and then left with no development and no change to those cities once the Olympics have been held. But the ideal model has also got to have a fourth element, I think. And that is where those three improvements are also joined by a long-term strategy about facility provision. It's quite interesting that in my hometown of Edinburgh in Scotland, where we held the Commonwealth Games in 1970, in those days the stadium for the Commonwealth Games cost £1 million in 1970. It now costs £700,000, three-quarters of that sum each year, just to keep the stadium open and running. So those long-term revenue implications are extremely important. And I do feel that many cities around the world do not pay enough attention to the facility strategy for the events. And we've heard from the Prince being open about some of the difficulties of some of the facilities in Malaysia. We've seen the difficulties of some of the facilities in Sydney after the Olympics. And I think we do need to pay more attention to that and make sure that facility provision is a key element of that strategic approach. This is starting, And it's been encouraging to see in Olympic terms that Barcelona, instead of building a new stadium, refurbished an existing stadium, that Atlanta Stadium is now an effective and well-used baseball stadium, that in Sydney, the Sydney Stadium, Australia, is now for Australian rules football. That in Manchester, the stadium there is going to be, on a long-term basis, the cost picked up by a football club. And in Melbourne in 2006, the Commonwealth Games will make use of Melbourne Cricket Ground. So I think people are paying more attention to that long-term legacy. And if we get that facility strategy right, along with international recognition, urban regeneration and sports development, then I think we have got the ideal strategy for the staging of major events. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. I'd like now, on the back of hopefully those provocative comments, to ask for questions or observations from the floor. There's if part of the reticence on candidates from the floor can be explained, the reticence on the part of the person who chairs the group that now manages the Meadowbank Stadium that Derek was referring to and has to cough up the £750,000 required to manage it annually is probably less difficult, less easy to explain, but still. Yeah.
It's been great, the presentations we've had this morning on touching on so many issues, but it seems to me we of course must be critical and questioning and evaluative and cautious about this huge phenomenon that's happening to us all, almost always around us every day. And it was notable, for instance, that Stephen Lewis in his address talked about the failures of globalization. Yet it does seem to me that, in one sense, sport globalization is a success story. It can't, we mustn't ignore the success side of it. That along with all the money making, there's a huge demand. And although it's wonderful in Australia, for example, to watch Australian rules football that nobody else in the world watches and knows about or understands. That's a unique and wonderful thing. There's something equally magical about watching the World Cup final and knowing that 2 or 3 billion other people at the same time are doing that, and there's a genuine sort of global community somehow or other emerging from all this, maybe. And it seemed to me that maybe we're neglecting that, which is something new and unique to this era. I don't know whether the panel members have any comments on that.
An immediate response. I think in the presentation I argued that there are costs and benefits, and there's winners and losers. And if you look at the diffusion of modern sport across the globe, one of its features, ironically, is that for the first time in humankind's history, of course, rules have been commonly accepted and agreed upon. Now, those rules, of course, were produced by specific groups, but those rules are now commonly embraced and accepted. And so at that level, of course, Tony, you're quite right to remind us of that may well be symptomatic of the fact that rules can be shared by different cultures and traditions and embraced in such ways. Likewise, there is some evidence in the literature for the idea that such festivals can provide us with positive messages of things we share in common as global citizens, and that the communication which occurs can provide a sense of commonality, a sense of social glue. which brings people and binds people together. The question, though, which would arise with major international sporting events is whether such occasions are but a temporary phenomena. That is, that whereas you can clearly assess the size and range of the audiences for, most recently, the Salt Lake City Games, albeit that that was contoured because of its winter dimension, but even if you take the summer games, huge audiences crisscrossing the globe in a variety of ways. The cool, hard scientific evidence on it is that that these phenomena are relatively fleeting and rather than deep and long-lasting. But for my mind, I'd probably keep an open mind at the moment as to its benefits as well as the costs.
I should have said that one of the, amongst the range of talents and experience that you have and our members of the panel, Kurt Schwirkele is an economist, a Stanford economist, as well as being involved in business in the private sector in relation to extreme sports, if I can use that term for the range of activities that he's involved in. But just couching Tony's question in relation to that, I wondered how an economist would defend expenditure on an ephemeral event. I mean, after all, we use public funds for firework displays. We're almost literally burning public money for the enjoyment of spectators. If you were asked as an economist to make a defence of expenditure on these ephemeral events, which we try to protect a legacy for, but nevertheless are come and gone within a 4-year cycle, what kind of defence would you put forward, Kurt?
Well, we've heard quite extensively about infrastructure improvements, urban rejuvenation, but these are just the more immediate and more visible effects from transport systems. I'm from Munich myself. I grew up during the time where Munich started to get ready for the 1972 Olympic Games. And as a child, I could see all of a sudden, of course, my parents were not very happy with having extra tax dollars levied on their income, but it certainly generated a great deal of, first of all, economic activity, to the pure construction of facilities. Of course, the multiplier effect to the economy has been ringgit for one event, which essentially one weekend. Of course, the question then is, again, is this the circus came to town and left, what next? If it starts to become, and the Manchester, the Birmingham example again, where it costs about £700,000 just to maintain this facility, from an economical point of view, it doesn't make much sense, because your life cycle costing for this stadium in about 1.5 years is actually exceeding the initial construction or the development cost. And there is certainly a big debate, be it on a policy level or from the economical point of view, does this make sense? And I would say I would still make a case for the investment over and above all the immediate contribution margins, contributions that are made to the society or the economy, but it's also the societal development, right? And it's hard to put a number to that sometimes. The values and lifestyles, the overall improvement to infrastructure that benefits everybody for years and years to come. It's not just one stadium, it's the entire infrastructure around it. So, again, where do we stop? Where does it make sense? Where does it doesn't make sense to develop stadia? If you look at countries like Bahrain or Lebanon now, Beirut, building Formula One tracks at great expense. In Shanghai, they're going to spend $270 million to build a Formula One track to host the 2004 Formula One event. It certainly has to do in Chinese terms and economic terms, as well as recognition international. We are a progressive, innovative city and country. Yes, those sort of investments certainly make a great deal of sense. Coming back again to Malaysia, I think we have the recognition of all our events, But of course, the continuing economic cost to maintain our facilities, this is where I think we need to start to take stock, do a social audit, do an audit of what we have in facilities, and see how those facilities can continue to generate revenues on an ongoing basis. So that's really where we should be looking at making an assessment where the tax dollars are at the end of the day are going. Thanks.
If you want to make an intervention from the floor, please wave a hand. In the interim, I'm going to ask our panel. Most of us are involved in advocacy for events. I think some of the questions, at least raised in our first session this morning by Joe Maguire, relate to challenging perhaps whether indeed even such events should be bid for. The political benefits of staging events and games and so on are often regularly raised as strong arguments. National morale, perhaps political advantage to the government in power in terms of sharing in the enthusiasm and the euphoria that comes from staging games. But what about some of the disbenefits? Are there examples of perhaps either political disbenefits, managerial disbenefits, and so on? Are there occasions, I'm asking the panel, are there criteria that one would apply which say that there are occasions on which one wouldn't actually bid to stage games at all?
Okay. I'd just like to answer this in two ways. One is, sometimes it's to do with the timing. There are, the Commonwealth Games 1998 could have been a total disaster for us. Whereas we started bidding in 1990 and we got the games awarded us in 1992 and we didn't stage the games until 1998. And in that intervening period, we had the Asian financial crisis in 1997. And as I said, we had this Anwar Ibrahim problem. I think most of you know that that's the problem where the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister had a problem, and then there's court cases, and our former Deputy Prime Minister now is in jail. And that could have been disastrous for the country. And I think in most cases where the disasters happen, I mean, I haven't done an exact case history on Montreal Olympics, but I understand that just the costs kept going up and they couldn't cap the costs, and therefore in the end, it turned out to be a financial disaster. So I think when one bids for the games, I think and Manchester almost became a financial disaster, if I'm right, Derek. It was very close to becoming a financial disaster. So one has to be very careful when one bids for a game, because really the games are not going to happen until quite a few years down the road. And you have to be a bit of a clairvoyant to identify a political crisis at the time, or a major, regional financial crisis at the time. But I think when one does bid for a game, I think one does so with as much foresight as one has at the time, and one does one's best. One aspect which I don't think that we've touched on, which is a benefit in Malaysia, by the way, is the fact that we do use games here, Southeast Asia games and our local Malaysia games, as a way of uniting the ethnic groups of Malaysia. It's games and sport is used, for community development and for racial integration, and the actual game. By the way, SEA Games means Southeast Asia Games. It's nothing to do with the water or the sea, okay? In case some of you who didn't know what SEA Games meant. When Dr. De Vries mentioned the SEA Games that he was writing about, it was a number of years ago, and it was at a time when we were, we were still getting some sort of ethnic problems, etc. And it was very good to see 100% sort of Chinese, ethnic Chinese, Malaysian basketball team going on to support, 100% Malay ethnic sepak takraw team. And these are the sort of phenomena that you get in Malaysian sport, and it's a great way of bringing the people together.
Thank you. Derek.
Well, also, just to follow that on with two examples, again, apologies from the United Kingdom, but just following on from what Rohan said about Manchester. Manchester, in a sense, put in the bid for the Commonwealth Games, as he said, uncontested. And I think it was only towards really about a year out from the Games that Manchester really began to appreciate that it's a relatively small city with a relatively small population and therefore a relatively small income from that population. And began to make the case that really this is a national bid and therefore the national government should pay for the event. And in the last 12 months, the government, through various means, had to provide an extra £120 million to make sure that the Games were successful. So I think that there are issues here about cities bidding for events outside a national context. The second point I want to make, and perhaps use the example, that at the moment there is a consideration of whether London should bid for the Olympic Games, perhaps in 2012 or 2016. And I was thinking about, if you put London against the criteria which I mentioned at the beginning, how would it fare in that assessment? Well, the first one is all about the repositioning of a country or a repositioning of a city. And I'd say that it is unlikely that London would need to reposition itself in world perception. The second issue is about infrastructure in a city. And one of the issues about the Olympic Games, there has been a trend towards having almost a campus-style approach to the Olympics, where the village and the facilities are on one site. And I suppose Sydney was a classic example of that. Now, if they followed that in London, you would know that all the problems of London, all the money that needs to be spent on London, on infrastructure and transport, would in a sense be focused on one site in London. And I'm not sure that would be to the benefit of London generally. And if there wasn't a campus approach in London, and they spread the facilities in the village around the city, it just emphasises the transport problems in London of getting around. And so it leads me to the third criteria, which is the question of sports development. Would it give a target to the United Kingdom to improve its position in world rankings in sport? Well, the answer probably would be yes, 8-10 years out. But then we have to ask, would it be better that that money was spent directly on sports development rather than on facilities and infrastructure in a city such as London? And I think more cities, more countries, really in a sense have to do that assessment to make sure they have a real rationale for the bidding for and the staging of major events.
I think, and following on from Derek's points there, is that to reassert the issue of environmentalism and sustainability. And those two, of course, have to be part of the equation in making an assessment about the relative impact which such events have. The contrast one could make, perhaps, is between Norway's holding of the Winter Games at Lillehammer as opposed to the French holding of the Games at Albertville. And the stark contrast between the two in terms of environmentalism and sustainability shows both the potential worth of such ventures and also the negative consequences. In addition to which, and I think Derek's alluding to this, is the question which would have to arise, not only in the terms I've expressed it, but even in the conventional terms it's understood, as to whether the money would be better spent elsewhere, achieving the same economic goals of development in urban regeneration. And you'd have to assess whether that's the case or not. And of course, you'd need the detailed research to support or undermine the thesis which was being proposed. The final point one would want to make is that, again, it's echoing one's questions which came up about the positive and negative dimensions. On the one hand, international sport occasions such as the Sydney Olympic Games and the opening and closing ceremonies give us powerful opportunities to provide images of how the country who's hosting the Games sees their own history, issues perhaps of reconciliation between the different groups who make up the Australian population, and also how it projects itself on a global stage. It's there, as I said earlier, 15 minutes of fame. There are, within global sport, positive messages to be gained. An individual breaks off on a transatlantic or ocean-going race to rescue another competitor, or the emancipation processes which work when you see a fellow Briton such as Ellen MacArthur sail single-handedly around the globe. Those are the positive messages. But on the other hand, though the Euro 96 championships were sold as we're in this together and bringing football back home, the media coverage surrounding the Euro 96 championships actually reinforced national stereotypes and negative perceptions of our fellow Europeans. So the audit has to take into account a variety of different dimensions, and I think those are part of the broader policy agendas which we would need to address as well.
Thank you. Leonard.
Yes. Yes, I just want to take the issue of the disbenefits. I guess it's not really disbenefits, but I think it's important for all of us, and that's what Professor Maguire indicated, to be aware of the impact that the achievement sport is having on us, the dominant factor, and this comes through international sports events. And I'm speaking from my work in Asia, and it's my perception that because of our interests in organizing international sports events, it is in Asia today the dominant factor in sport. I think it sets the priority for most Asian governments. When you set your priority on international sports events, and when you set your priorities on high performance sport, achievement sport, then you tend to neglect the cultural, the body culture kinds of activities, the indigenous kinds of activities, the activities for sports for all. I think in Asia, that is the factor that's taking place in Asia. And I think it bothers many of us. And whether we can do anything about it, I think the first thing is we've got to be aware of it, and I'm not sure whether we can do anything about it. That's my first point I want to make. The other is that it has a very great influence on the media, you know. The media is only interested, it seems to me, on this achievement sport, on international sport events, on athletes and teams. And they don't seem to give enough coverage or are more interested in the other aspects of sport performance, the body culture, the indigenous kinds of activities, the sports for leisure, sports for all, and sports for health and well-being of the people. I think, and there are other more influences that it's having. I think that's something for all of us to be aware of. Thank you.
Well, our time as a panel is almost up, and I think before I ask Tony Beale to make one or two announcements from the floor in terms of housekeeping, perhaps I'll try and summarise the the positions that have been reviewed. I think what we've had from each of our various speakers, both in terms of the two plenaries this morning and in terms of the subsequent discussion and sort of position statements almost that people have made, is almost a shopping list in terms of what is required for the effective development of event strategies at a national and at a city level. And clearly, much of the discussion has been about sustainable development, and sustainability tends to be regarded in terms of either environmental, the physical environment, or in terms of cultural development. But I think economically sustainable development is also important. Socially sustainable development, as Joe Maguire has just given us a couple of examples of how we might use things productively to promote positive social outcomes, but also perhaps managerial sustainability, looking at ways of managing revenue streams to ensure that populations aren't saddled with future debts. Perhaps the one side that we haven't looked at is the responsibility of the organisations that to whom we bid, the IOCs, the Commonwealth Games, the European Championships and so on, which either by their expressed expectations or their implicit expectations place a burden on bidding cities and bidding countries to provide things which are perhaps less aimed towards the needs of the local population than towards the needs of running the event, which may come and go in a relatively short space of time. So I'll close with that brief summary, and I'll thank not only our two plenary speakers but our three other panel members for their intervention and their involvement in the discussion this morning.
Thank you, George. Let me first record my thanks to the organisers of the World Leisure Congress for their invitation to address you today. I would also like to thank our Malaysian hosts for their warm reception and welcome to their country. It's been gratifying to actually receive such hospitality. I would also like to bring you greetings from, as George mentioned, as President of the International Sociology of Sport Association, colleagues who share many interests with yourselves here today. My purpose today is to review the social scientific evidence regarding sport and globalization. By necessity, I provide an overview, and I'll avoid any detailed theoretical discussion. I've got my excuses now in first, you see. I want to assess the emergence, diffusion and globalization of modern sport. In doing so, I want to examine the costs and benefits, winners and losers involved in global sport processes. I've tried to capture through this narrative and analysis in the title of the paper, Global Village or Global Pillage. The work I've been doing over the past decade or so, involved particularly in the work Global Sport, but in a forthcoming book, Power in Global Sport, convinces me that we need to examine the local-global nexus, how it's interconnected, interdependent. In so doing, and in painting things as they really are, I want to argue for a vision that is in keeping with the goals of the World Leisure Congress and which respects diversity, promotes sustainability, and advocates equity between peoples and nations. Let me first then lay the foundations of my argument, looking at the conceptual and empirical building blocks, and in so doing, ask you to think about the policy implications of what I will say today. First then, the concept of globalization. Despite some advocates, political or otherwise, the social scientific evidence would suggest that globalization is a much longer, deeper process than we would recognize. That in fact, if you review the literature in relation to the development of sport in particular, one can identify perhaps a 5-phase ongoing process. More of that later. In addition to which, one might capture the flows which actually characterize globalization in terms of a figuration, a network of interdependencies, of people migrating, of capital, finance, of technology, which of course assists my presentation and my ability to be here, of mediated images, in which the media sport complex is one part, and of ideas expressed through the Olympic ideologies and other sources. These structured processes, if you will, both enable and constrain us. They liberate us, but they also constrain us. We have to recognize then that the history of global processes, particularly with reference to sport, involves a power geometry, a set of power relationships between established and outsider groups. And that established and outsider groups involves not simply that between nations and peoples, but also between social classes, gender groups, ethnic identities. Therefore, when we're seeking to examine global processes, what would be the main dynamics involved? Looking at the literature, of course, a number of researchers point to the economic dimension, and clearly the political economic dimension of global sport requires detailed consideration. But I would argue that such an economic and political analysis is a necessary but not sufficient analysis. That is, that we need to actually understand the social and cultural processes which are also making and remaking the global sport process. What are the key power struggles involved? Historically, we can see that the emergence and diffusion of global sport processes have involved struggles between the West and the rest. That is, of course, that there's a clear linkage between the diffusion of global sport and various empires which made up the 19th and early 20th century global power relationships. But more on that in a moment. One should not try to reduce, however, global processes to solely the machinations, the intentions of power elites. There is also a series of unintended outcomes and dimensions to global processes, some of which we are in the throes of now, in terms of seeing how our actions lead to unintended consequences of a variety of means. What have been the long-term consequences? Later in this address, what I will try to do is suggest that there have been a number of key consequences in relation to the diffusion of what we know of as modern sport, and that those consequences pose dangers but also provide opportunities to us as citizens of the globe. In keeping with the theme of this conference, then, what one needs to do is see how globalization processes, to use some jargon, has both universal significance, sport being one example, that it actually cross-cuts continents and nations, but has local particular meaning. Whether we're talking about Finnish baseball or baseball in Japan, the diffusion process is characterized by a series of power relationships, but it takes on local meaning within the specific cultures themselves. They are very long-term processes, not of relatively recent origin. As I will make the case, like the steam engine, modern sport emerges in England first. And we would therefore need to probe the issue back some 300 years. But global processes, arguably, are actually far more deeply rooted. Some argue that it would be stretching it back to the 15th century, others to the early developments of world religions, where we would actually look to the 6th or 7th century. However, it would also be a mistake to actually view these global processes as simply the flow from the West to other parts of the world. We don't have sufficient evidence, and of course scholars here today perhaps who might want to take up this challenge. Individuals alone can't actually complete this task. What we need to do collectively is explore how there are non-Western influences on the development of play and games in the European mainland, both in the medieval and early modern period. Likewise, what we have to do is examine non-Occidental and European influences on recent phases. Although as a Briton, I might seek to highlight the particular role of the United Kingdom in the development of global sport, one would not be doing one's job as a social scientist if one didn't point to the influence of other European traditions, nor indeed the diffusion more recently within the global sport process of martial arts and other non-European body cultures to the West and to other parts of the globe itself. Therefore, what I would suggest in understanding globalization and in understanding global sport, one has to adopt a multi-directional analysis. We're dealing with processes which diffuse in complex ways, ways which actually are not reducible to solely the intentions of multinational corporations, though they are a key part, and that we need a multi-causal analysis, that economics and politics are clearly part of this process, but also subtle social and cultural factors require attention. We must therefore reconcile the hegemony of the West with a culture's ability to resist, reinterpret and recycle global sport products. Looking at the history of sport then, we can see, to use a German phrase, that there is no sporting Gemeinschaft, no isolated sporting community waiting to be discovered. The local has always been connected with another locality. The local always reworks what we now call the global. The local is permeated by and contoured by a range of forces, centrifugal and centripetal, those which close in upon themselves and those which expand outwards to different communities. What we require then, in the tradition of sociology which I follow, is an analysis which directs our attention to the relationships between not only localities and nations, but also to civilizations. A series of power networks are involved: economic, political, military, and cultural, which involve struggles between peoples, but also emulation processes. These emulation processes involve copying, of course, high-status individuals, high-status groups, and high-status nations. As we'll see when I try to give you a brief narrative of the history of what I'm describing, we'll see that the British, for example, were both eliminating folk cultures, but at the same time their practices were being emulated by others. The history of globalization then, and the history of global sport in particular, involves a contest of sameness, difference and commingling of diffusion processes between established and outsider groups. What I'm arguing for then is that we have to understand global sport as a very long-term process involving 5 phases, and that these 5 phases can be identified beginning with what I would describe as the emergent phase. So let me try to give you some narrative to the bare bones concepts and foundations I've been describing so far. Around the 1720s, historians debate this constantly, but that what we begin to see is the emergence of modern sport as we know it, in the various clubs which emerges in the context of England first. Here we see the early development of sports which we would eventually know today as cricket, but also we see the slow emergence and diffusion of folk games of football into the modern forms of association football and rugby. The 1720s to 1830s within the British Isles also sees the decline and destruction of a range of folk games, no longer acceptable either morally or legally. Animal sports decline quite rapidly, again for a variety of reasons. So what we see in this early development is both the destruction and narrowing of body cultures and folk games and play, but also then the establishment of what we know increasingly and term modern sport. The second phase one could describe is within the British Isles, but gradually diffusing to other parts of the empire, a consolidation of what we would regard as modern sport, achievement sport. Here we see in the development of public schools, but also gradually in state provision of education, formal gymnastics, but also the games which we associate with the British imperial elite. Track and field, yachting, cricket, rugby, football take on its modern forms, not only in terms of the actual manner of the game itself and the rules which are codified, but also in terms of the associations which begin to regulate such conduct. Initially, of course, within the British Isles, gradually European and global more broadly. However, it's not until approximately the 1870s through to the 1920s, which coincides, and not by accident, with a take-off phase in global processes more broadly, that what we see is the rapid diffusion of these modern sports along the lines of the formal and informal British Empire. That is, of course, both the British were bringing their Bible and their bat with them to Africa, to Asia, to parts of South America, but also their citizens were migrating to various parts of the world, to South Africa, to New Zealand, and to Australia. So we see a take-off phase both in global processes, but we also see a take-off phase in the diffusion of what was once peculiar, specific British pastimes, but which are now diffusing across the globe. Let me just qualify, though, what I've said so far. In the context of European folk games and traditions, a variety of folk games and traditions existed, were actively participated in. There was resistance to the diffusion of British sports in Germany, in France, and elsewhere. The mainland Europeans had their own gymnastics traditions, which also, to a degree, diffused to the United States, to Canada, and elsewhere. Likewise, our Scandinavian colleagues would remind us that, of course, Nordic Idrott traditions actually diffused to North America and retain, of course, their vibrancy through to the present day. So, in other words, although I've described a peculiarly British affair, one might actually regard this phase in global sport processes as a European affair. That is, it involves primarily Europeans in a variety of ways, through their industry, their captains of industry establishing plants and industries in various countries, or through their navies, the Royal Navy visiting Rio, establishing a team called the Corinthians, for example, or through their migration of peoples to different parts of the world, we see the diffusion of these modern sports, but also the gymnastics traditions of mainland Europe and the winter games from Norway, Sweden, and elsewhere in Scandinavia. If the third phase, very crudely, could be described as an Anglo-European affair, the fourth phase, post-First World War, one would describe as a North American and more specifically an American affair. Indeed, of course, other scholars have described the 20th century as America's century. And in some respects, in terms of global sport, one would argue that has also been the case. Not only, of course, did specific modern sports begin to take on an American form in the late 19th century, early 20th century, such as, of course, American football, diffusing from the United Kingdom and developed at Harvard and Yale into its modern form from rugby, but also sports such as basketball and volleyball take on their modern form and invention in the context of the US. Note too, though, that just as British and European sports diffused to their spheres of influence, volleyball and basketball diffused to the American spheres of influence, along with baseball, that is, to South America and to Asia more broadly. But it is not only in terms of the specific sports which we have to look to in terms of the Americanization phase, but also the meanings which actually are given to specific sports. So, of course, the old amateur ideology, the old sense of fair play, and of not taking sport too seriously gradually wanes, and the model which is derived from the United States takes on a more serious intent. The professional athlete usurps the amateur ideology, and a more scientific approach to the study of sport and sports performance takes on its modern form. So it's not only the content of sport, but the meaning given to sporting practice which actually undergoes an Americanization phase. Furthermore, of course, what we also see is that the influence of North Americans on the development of modern sport starts to take place within the corridors of power of modern sport, where once it was exclusively a European affair, where the hands of empire could actually pull the levers of modern sport, increasingly it becomes that of the United States and the West more broadly. In sport after sport, in continent after continent, therefore, what we see in the history of the 20th century, post-First World War, is the consolidation and colonization of folk cultures and modern sports. If you take the history of track and field in Africa, choose Kenya as an example, the folk games and traditions of that culture wither away to a large degree, and modern sports take on their various forms. Track and field becomes synonymous with Kenya, or what we know as Kenya, and a particular set of athletes thrive and come to the stage on a global arena through the 1968 Olympics. So colonization, as one example of what I'm describing, Kenya, is intensified in the phase 1920s to 1960s. But I wouldn't want to convey that it was all a one-way process here either, because in this same period we also see resistance. We also see the local responding to the global. How might this be evident? The history of what I've described so far was not only a British or European or American affair, it was also a male affair, because of course the emergence and consolidation of modern sport was by men, for men, able-bodied men at that. And so what one also sees is the slow and gradual resistance to such sport processes on a local and on a global stage by women in a variety of ways. Indeed, if you look at the history of track and field in the 1920s, the evidence suggests that women, although at that stage European primarily, were actually involved in a greater range of track and field activities than they were when they eventually gained access to the Olympic Games later in the 1920s. And it wasn't until 1964 that in fact they got back to the same range of events as they once did when they were independent in the early 1920s. So the history of this fourth phase is of contestation in terms of gender rights. Furthermore, what we also see, of course, is that in this period, struggle is taking place at a geopolitical level. In the post-war period, the struggle between the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, is also played out on the sports field. Whether it's those famous games between Canada and the Soviet Union at ice hockey, whether it's actually within the games themselves in terms of the league or medal table between the United States and the Soviet Union, or within a country disunited in terms of Germany and the Federal Republic and the GDR. So struggle is taking place at that level as well. But note at this point, of course, the struggle is still about access and status and resources within the terms set by modern sport. It's access to modern sport rather than a countercultural response to that body form, modern sport. If we identify then the more recent phase of modern sport, what we see is an intensification in terms of struggle. And yet there's a paradoxical feature to this. The consolidation of modern sport has taken place at the same time as this intensification of struggle. The media sport complex has provided us with beguiling images of famous athletes such as Michael Jordan, or famous occasions such as the golf tournament in Augusta at Easter. Those of us with sufficient memories will note that in 1964, the first live broadcast of the Olympics back to the United Kingdom from Japan, the first time, of course, an Asian country had hosted the Games, the Summer Games. It looked like the very few medals which the British won on that occasion was being competed in snow. The technology was poor and in black and white. Now, of course, we accept that the media sport complex will provide us with images which are crisp, clear and in colour. And in that same period, from 64 to the present day, we've also seen the development of mediated sports on a global level. In particular, of course, they tend to be American sports, primarily basketball, ice hockey, and the ubiquitous, perhaps, American football. So, on the one hand, the evidence suggests a consolidation of this modern sport and mediated in specific ways and marketed to us as a form of consumption. It is not simply the sport which is diffusing, therefore, and it's not simply an ideology, whether that's of the professional or the amateur, but it's a diffusion of a consumption of the products which go along with the sport itself. The running shoe, the appropriate top, the uniform, etc., and the various merchandising goods. But paradoxically, in contrast to that consolidation at the media sport level, what I would suggest we also can identify is several countercultural responses. What would they be? Firstly, we've seen the revival of folk games. A number of societies have retained such folk games and have actually, in the context of a rapidly changing world, of what Alvin Toffler many years described as future shock, that what we seem to see is that citizens in various localities are searching for anchors of meaning. And one of those anchors of meaning may well be, of course, a revival of folk games. Our Swedish colleagues will remind us, of course, of the folk game traditions which survive in Gotland and elsewhere. In addition to which, Swiss colleagues, if any are here, would remind us that Ringen and Schwingen are still activities which provide meaning and significance to individuals within their own modern, highly globalized nation states. Furthermore, not just within the West, but beyond, various citizens in different parts of the world are beginning to actually recognize that their own folk games, their own traditions, are worthy of retention. Secondly, this period seems to also harbour the beginnings of a more radical critique of modern sport in its own terms. And here our feminist colleagues can take the credit. Because, of course, from the mid-1960s onwards, colleagues, first in terms of access to sport, whether it was Title IX, or more recently in terms of whether the tough masculine characteristics of modern sport are really worth playing, are raising fundamental questions about the damage as well as the advantages which we experience in modern sport. We're also, of course, thirdly, beginning to see not simply a diffusion from the West to the rest, but as I noted earlier, a diffusion of body cultural traditions from different parts of the world to the West itself and then on to other areas. The martial arts tradition of this part of the world in various ways have actually been taken on board by particular groups and individuals who no longer see modern sport as the exclusive way in which to express themselves in a body form. So martial arts are providing us with alternatives. within the West, the dominance of modern sport is also being modified by a younger generation of people. People who actually no longer see skiing as simply the preserve of a middle-class elite, but are interested in snowboarding and other activities which are or could be viewed as countercultural. The development of extreme sports, likewise, provide us with alternative messages of what it is to be active, healthy, and at leisure, and connected to our colleagues as individuals, but also to the terrain in which we live. Each in their own way are raising fundamental questions about modern sport and its influence and hold upon the people of the world. And finally, of course, one might regard the development of activities such as the Gay Games as yet one more struggle in the characteristic of modern sport and the terrain and meaning which actually gives it significance. I've provided a rather broad brush, but what I've tried to convey to you in this 5-phase model then is of emergence and consolidation of specific types of body, culture and traditions which we know as modern achievement sport, that it has always been contested and that it's always been mediated at a local level, and that more recently the hold of modern sport, while being fueled by a media sport complex, by transnational corporations who perhaps want to transform citizens not into active participants but into inactive consumers, is also being contested at other levels by women, by people who want to search for alternative meanings to those provided to us by the media sport complex. But I also suggested earlier that there's been a series of structured processes. How then are we to weigh up the costs and benefits, the winners and losers in what I've described so far? I think we can clearly say from the evidence presented that achievement sport is the dominant body cultural tradition on the planet as we know it today. That folk games have become residual. Although retained, they're at the margins. But that new body cultural forms, whether it's martial arts, extreme sports, are at perhaps an emergent phase. The future, of course, is yet to unfold, but we as citizens can actually take an active part in making such a history in the future. Just as the past was made by people like ourselves, we too can actually contribute to that process of development. In such organizations like the World Leisure Congress, or elsewhere, we can actually inform practice through policy informed by certain principles. Overall then, what I think we can see is a diminishing contrast between body cultural traditions. There is evidence, therefore, of homogeneity, just as there is evidence of homogeneity in art, music, food, so too in sport. But there is also evidence for heterogeneity in global processes, of increasing varieties, both in terms of artistic expression, but also food, music, and sport. In food, we see, of course, the ubiquitous golden arches, the McDonaldization of food across the globe. But even in a small market town such as Loughborough, we also see evidence of diversity in terms of ethnic groups providing us with a different diet. And I would suggest that Loughborough is not unique in that regard. But also in music. The history of music shows us the complexity of global processes. Our American friends amongst us know, of course, that jazz has been a lovely musical gift they've given to others across the world, but that the history of jazz is connected to the history of African people within that continent as well. The connections of modern musical forms in all its varieties has a political economy in terms of the ownership and control of the CDs which we play and listen, but also we would know from the interconnections at a cultural level, that creolization is also at work in our musical forms. Sport may be less malleable. It actually may have a greater rigidity in some respects. But body cultures are like music and food. New varieties, as well as diminishing contrasts, then I think are the story I would like to convey. In summary, if I can begin to move in that direction, I think we've seen the decline of Western and non-Occidental folk body cultures. I wish I could say it otherwise, but I think that is the case. We've also seen the emergence and diffusion of a gendered ideology, content and control of global sport. Whereas a young American may be able to take her soccer top off after scoring a wonderful goal and wave it round her head, the levers of global sport still remain, by and large, in the hands of men. The third structured process, which I think we can identify, is that modern sport has been consolidated not just through the activities of associations or of multinational corporations, but also of the state itself in various forms. From PT to drill, from physical education to its more recent manifestations of sports science. And the scientization of physical education itself has its own implications. That is, over the longer term, and again this parallels processes which are at work in culture more broadly, we've seen the gradual medicalization, scientization, rationalization and commodification of expressiveness, where once folk cultures could be expressed and lived in their own terms. Increasingly, of course, modern sport has to be reduced to the analysis of the VO2 max. We have to actually run on the Cybex machine, and we have to understand sports performance in terms of outcome rather than the intrinsic experience it might bring us. Therefore, the athlete has become, or arguably is becoming, an enhanced, efficient machine. Look at the literature within sports sciences more broadly. And that we're perhaps at the frontier, not of drugs, which may become passé in terms of sport performance, but of genetic modification and, looking forward in this century, to a cyborg coexistence, not beyond the realms, perhaps, of science fiction as we know it. And finally, I think we can also see, and this has implications in relation to what we've been describing in terms of the World Leisure Congress, we have to look at the winners and losers in terms of environmental concerns. That the athlete, the spectator and viewer over time has become a consumer of scarce resources and destroyers of the environment. Whether it's at a local level, a university level, a national level, or a global level, whenever we construct stadia, whenever we develop facilities, as part of the remit, and indeed it was for Sydney, but perhaps better so for Lillehammer, we've got to insert within the development process a green ethos. The emergence of a global sport power elite, however, is a more difficult one to tackle. Whether it be at the nation-state level, national governing bodies, TNCs, transnational corporations, or the transnational capitalist class, we need more detailed empirical research which tries to identify that web of interests. And in so identifying, as I will point to in my conclusion, we need to democratize, we need to make such decisions more transparent, and we need to make our masters more accountable. And finally, in terms of the modern global sport process, I would suggest that, and I wish it was otherwise, that we've seen the reinforcement and enhancement of global inequalities within the West and between the West and non-Occidental societies. I'm not simply suggesting that this is in terms of the winners on the field of play, but off the field of play. Therefore, I think what we've seen is habitat degradation, as our colleagues in the green environmental movement point to. Depletion and extinction of the environment, places and spaces is going on at a rapid rate. Sport plays its own part in that process, but we perhaps need to make the footprint which we make on the earth a little less heavy. But there's also been what one might call habitus degradation, that are deeply internalized notions of what it is to be an embodied self, an embodied being, has become narrowed. The options have become less available to us. That modern sport becomes the form of body expressiveness. Though, as I suggested, there are hopeful signs that people are retaining different folk traditions and that new extreme sports or martial arts might provide alternatives to us. So let me reach towards the conclusion, if I may. The threats to diversity, the threats to sustainability, arguably come from a variety of sources. From the sports Olympic development movement per se, from the sports goods industry, Nike, Adidas and others, from the media sport production complex, where satellite corporations beam to us particular mediated, saturated images, and from a sports science monoculture, where when we visit different universities and different departments, where we examine different curricula, increasingly, of course, they become narrowed, scientized, and the humanistic dimensions are lost. The alternatives. It would be wrong of me to finish without suggesting that there are ways in which we can empower ourselves. So instead of a human performance model, we can actually begin to develop a human development model, informed by green ethics, where our natural scientific colleagues who do enter the terrain in environmental concerns, in genetics, and in other spheres of human endeavour, are arguing for, or at least the more imaginative, for sustainable science. Science itself is not simply a destructive force. It can actually provide us with sustainable solutions. And so too with sport. I'm not suggesting, and I hope you haven't got this message, that I'm suggesting that sport is totally destructive. What I'm arguing for is a sustainable sport process which respects diversity and nurtures sustainability. And in so doing, we place the issues of health and well-being at the forefront rather than performance. As Bertolt Brecht remarked, where elite sport begins, good health ends. And so what we need to promote then is a movement diversity of various cultures and respecting them in their own way. Respect for diversity then, and the richness of local habitats and cultures should be one aspect of the call I would make to our colleagues here today. Recognition that different body and sport traditions have meaning and significance. And that the practice of sport be based on principles of sustainability for individuals, local cultures and environments. And here I depart from some observations made about globalization elsewhere, that in fact globalization is not the threat per se, it's how we manage globalization which is the threat. We need to empower ourselves. We need to actually seek solutions both at the local level, but some problems are so widespread that we require a global governance. We must involve both the more powerful nations of the world, but also those who actually bring to the table whatever resources they have. And in so doing, as I mentioned earlier, the power elite have to be held accountable, decisions made transparent and positions more democratically based. Is that too much to argue for? So better sport worlds for individuals, communities and environments at the local level, following on from the ethos of this conference, that sport worlds need to balance the local with global interdependence. We are interdependent as a people, and that awareness has grown more greatly recently, of course. And that, perhaps, should be the new global order. Thank you very much.
A small present from the organizers of the Congress.
We just had Professor Joe Maguire from Loughborough University, which, by the way, I knew very well because I went to university just down the road from Loughborough at Nottingham. And we used to have some great battles with Loughborough. In those days, of course, Loughborough was more than just Loughborough University. They had two of them. One was Loughborough Colleges and the other one was Loughborough University. And Loughborough Colleges was the really number one physical education college in the UK and produced all the best sportsmen. So now that they've merged, I presume Loughborough University must be the number one sporting university in the United Kingdom. And so much so, Joe Maguire was telling me that the English Cricket Board have decided to establish their academy, cricket academy in Loughborough. So I think we've had a very, very interesting morning with Joe Maguire. I'm afraid we now go local, having been global and international. We come to Malaysia and the Commonwealth Games experience in Malaysia in 1998. We also have a difference. My presentation is very old-fashioned. I'm going to read it from a piece of paper. I don't have the magnificent overheads and slides that Joe had, so please bear with me. It'll be about 20 minutes. And then I'm very happy to answer questions as part of the panel, if anyone would like to ask any questions. I'd like to thank the organizers of the 7th World Leisure Congress for inviting me to address you on the Commonwealth Games in 1998, its implications for Malaysia, and the effect it had internationally. For those of you not familiar with the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth Games, let me briefly try and explain what I'm talking about. The Commonwealth of Nations is an informal body which had its roots in the former British Empire. In fact, the Commonwealth Games began as the Empire Games in 1930. Today's Commonwealth is an association of 54 independent nations whose main links with the British Empire and Britain are the fact that the British Queen is still regarded as the head of the Commonwealth and English is its common language. At a political and government level, the main forum is the biennial Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, or CHOGM as they call it. The objective of this meeting is for the leaders of those nations to get to know each other better and to discuss matters of common interest. Although there is a Commonwealth Secretariat with a Secretary General, there are no hard and fast rules of membership, and any country can apply to become a member. The two newest members of the Commonwealth are Mozambique and the Cameroons, both joining just before the 1998 Games. Apart from CHOGM, the most important and high-profile activity of the Commonwealth is the celebration of the Commonwealth Games, which occurs every 4 years. In fact, just 2.5 months ago, the 17th Games were held in Manchester, England, as part of the British monarch's Golden Jubilee celebrations, with 72 participating countries and almost 6,000 athletes and officials. The first Games, held in Hamilton, Canada, attracted 11 countries and 400 athletes. The Commonwealth Games are owned by the Commonwealth Games Federation, which comprises membership from 72 countries and territories. It should be noted that a number of non-independent territories are members, such so that Scotland, Northern Ireland, Jersey, Guernsey, the Falkland Islands, St. Helena send athletes to the Games and compete under their respective banners. The Games are dedicated, as no other sporting event, to the principles of democracy amongst nations. So sovereign nations, such as Malaysia and Canada, stand equal to the likes of Vanuatu and the Isle of Man. The vision of the Commonwealth Games is to promote a unique, friendly, world-class games and to develop sport for the benefit of the people, the nations, and the territories of the Commonwealth, and thereby strengthen the Commonwealth. The uniqueness of the Games is in its friendly atmosphere, and they are often called the Friendly Games. And I think some of you may have noticed one of Joe Maguire's slides was about the Friendly Games. The 16th Commonwealth Games was held in Kuala Lumpur in 1998, and it was conceived actually 8 years earlier when the Olympic Council of Malaysia decided to make a bid for Games. The main reason for bidding was to raise the profile of sport in this country and to show the sporting world that we were capable of organizing a major multi-sport event. The bid had far-reaching implications for sport in the Commonwealth, as Malaysia, as host nation, would have been the first independent country which did not have the Queen of England as its head of state, and it was also would have been the first country in Asia to host the Games. Kuala Lumpur finally won the right to host the 1998 Games, in Barcelona, in fact, in 1982, beating Adelaide from Australia as the other bidder. It was the first time in the history of the Commonwealth Games Federation that so much had been spent on bids for the Games. Malaysia's bid cost us approximately 5 million ringgit, which in the history of Malaysian sport is the largest amount spent on such an exercise. It is interesting to note that the bids by Manchester for the 2002 Games and by Melbourne, Australia for the 2006 Games were uncontested. Ladies and gentlemen, at this stage, I'd like to play a short video which will show you just how grand and how much fun the 1998 Games were for all concerned, and also how much of a Malaysian and therefore a local atmosphere there was. Can we have the video, please? probably saw a glimpse of my parents there, because they were the king and queen at the time during the Games. Ladies and gentlemen, the 16th Commonwealth Games in Kuala Lumpur proved to be a watershed in the history of the Commonwealth Games. Apart from being the first Games held in Asia, it was the biggest Games up till then in terms of number of athletes participating and number of sports played. It was the first time that team sports were introduced, and a record number of 70 countries participated in the 16-sport program. The government spent hundreds of millions of ringgit on building new facilities and upgrading existing ones, even though the evaluation committee, which is appointed by the Commonwealth Games Federation, felt that we could run the Games with the existing facilities at the time. It is significant that the 70,000 capacity Shah Alam Stadium was not even utilized during the Commonwealth 98 Games. Many sports have benefited from the Games with the construction of beautiful state-of-the-art facilities. These include, of course, athletics, swimming, squash, shooting, hockey, netball, and lawn bowls, whilst the existing velodrome and 8 cricket pitches were upgraded. Did we need to build such new facilities? And what has become of these stadia? The construction of the National Sports Complex at Bukit Jalil, the Kiara Stadium and Lawn Bowl Centre, and the LISRAM shooting range in Langkawi certainly enhanced the Games. It made the Commonwealth Games look and feel more like an Olympic Games, as you saw in the video, and was one of the main reasons why the 98 Games became so memorable, and in the eyes of the sporting world, put Malaysia finally on the map of countries that have the capability of hosting major sports events. Some of the magnificent stadia have been well utilized since 1998, whilst others have been somewhat underutilized. And there are many reasons for this underutilization, main ones being its geographical location. For instance, Langkawi is an island well to the north of here. It's a resort island, and really not necessarily that conducive to having a lot of shooting events. And the owners of the stadia, which are mainly the government, have been charging some high rental for some of their stadia, so some stadia are not as well utilized as they could have been. The Games itself attracted 5,065 athletes and officials, 14,585 volunteers on duty, and a record of 15 client broadcasters, with Australia being the biggest. The 15th of September 1998 was rated as the highest sports audience in Australian TV history. And that was when Australia, it was mainly for the swimming, when they were expecting their swimming team to beat the world record, which they actually did. Whilst New Zealand and South Africa had extremely high ratings too. Hockey and cricket were beamed to 50 countries, either live or in highlights format. The host broadcaster, the Radio Television Malaysia, which is a government-owned station, took the opportunity to upgrade their equipment and train their people. They now have some of the best outside broadcast equipment in the region and some of the best trained camera and backup crews. Unfortunately, again, they have not capitalized on this fact and have not even utilized the new International Broadcasting Center, which was built at a cost of 60 million, to the best advantage. Financially, the Games were a relative success. I think you all know that the 1997 Asian financial crisis, again, it occurred just about a year before the Games, caused many potential sponsors to either disappear or downgrade their sponsorship. Despite this, the revenue raised from the Games was up till then the highest in the history of the Commonwealth Games. The TV rights fee were also a record for both the Commonwealth Games and for a Malaysian sporting event. As a celebration of sport, the 1998 Games was an unqualified success. Malaysia won a record of 36 medals, with 10 gold, 14 silver and 12 bronze, coming an unprecedented fourth on the medal table. The participants, the visitors, and the people of Malaysia had a great time. The spirit and feeling of the Malaysian nation was on cloud 9. Malaysia had produced, to quote Mike Fennell, the chairman of the Commonwealth Games Federation, the best ever games, and kept up the tradition of hosting a friendly games. The games were now on a new footing. They had become a major international sporting event. No more were the Commonwealth Games a multi-sport event consisting of 10 individual sports. They were now up to 16 sports, with 5 of them team sports. They were now high profile and important to the host city, which was very apparent in Manchester earlier this year, and which you will certainly see in Melbourne in 2006. So did we meet our goals? What did the Games do for Malaysia? Was it something worthwhile and strategically important for the continuing development of the country? Or was it a waste of time, money and effort? There is no doubt that the 1998 Commonwealth Games in Kuala Lumpur put Malaysia on the world sporting map. During this year alone, 2002, for instance, we have had numerous international sporting events, including the World Cup of Hockey, that is for those of you from North America, field hockey, the Southeast Asia Fencing Championships, the Tour de Langkawi cycle race, the Malaysian Open Golf, the International Rugby Board Rugby Sevens, the Asian Squash Championships, the Asian Basketball Confederation Championships, the Asian Junior Davis Cup Tennis, the Malaysian Formula One Grand Prix, the Malaysia Cricket Challenge, and recently, last week, the Espirito Santo World Amateur Team Golf Championships for women, and starting this week, the Eisenhower Trophy for men's amateur golf. We've also had major sports meetings and conferences such as this. We've had this, including this week, we'll have the World Squash Federation's annual general meeting, which starts on Thursday. And recently, in May, we had the General Assembly of the Association of National Olympic Committees, or we call it ANOC, in conjunction with the meeting of the Executive Board of the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. For this particular event, the Presidents and Secretaries General of 198 out of the 199 NOCs of the world visited KL and spent almost a week in fruitful deliberation. I suppose some of you will want to know who that country that didn't turn up. It was actually Peru, and not because they didn't want to, but their delegate had a personal problem on his way to the airport and missed the plane, or had to remain in Peru, and unfortunately they didn't have time to send another delegate. Even the newest country in the world, East Timor, sent an observer to that meeting. The General Assembly attracted all sorts of people. We had organizing committees from Athens, Turin Winter Games, Manchester Commonwealth Games, Busan Asian Games, and Beijing. And the new IOC president, Jacques Rogge, was so impressed by the efficient organization of the event, the wonderful hotel and conference facilities, and the impressive structure of our city. And he said, and I quote, "Although I promised you in Salt Lake City that I would not follow my predecessor, President Samaranch, in saying that any event was the best ever, I have to say now that this General Assembly of ANOC is certainly the best ever." We have also had visits by major football teams. Manchester United, the Brazilians were here on the way to Korea and Japan for the recent FIFA World Cup, and of course all Malaysians, because Malaysia never qualified for the World Cup finals, will always say that it was because of their visit here in Malaysia that Brazil won the World Cup. So, you know, we sometimes bask in this reflected glory. But what the Commonwealth Games has done for Malaysia is actually to give us a greater sense of confidence in our ability to organize major events, leading to that now famous slogan, which maybe some of you know or may not know, called Malaysia Boleh, which is translated as Malaysia can or Malaysia can do. The Games took away the depression of the Asian financial crisis, and there was certainly a feel-good atmosphere in the country, which helped us get through the Anwar Ibrahim political crisis, which actually started while the Games was on. Malaysia has since made a bid, unfortunately unsuccessfully, for the 2006 Asian Games, and in all probability will bid again for the 2010 Games. Next year, the country, for instance, will play host to the World 10-Pin Bowling Championships, and there are numerous other events being contemplated. Malaysian tourism has also benefited from the hosting of the 1998 Commonwealth Games. The Malaysia Truly Asia slogan is now well known throughout the world, and the fact that this World Leisure Congress being held here today and this week is partly a result of this newfound confidence. In terms of the other benefits that the country garnered from the Games was the awareness of some of the products and equipment that Malaysia produces and manufactures. Electronic scoreboards, sports apparel, seating are examples. Since 1998, Malaysian manufacturers have supplied, for instance, the main electronic scoreboard for the Rawalpindi Cricket Stadium in Pakistan, sports apparel for many, many of those countries that participated in the Olympic Games in Sydney 2000 and the recent Asian Games in Busan. Even the temporary seating in Sydney 2000 and at Manchester this year was supplied by Malaysian companies. Malaysia's infrastructure was also enhanced for the Games. The Kuala Lumpur International Airport was accelerated and was opened only a few months before the Games. And the construction of new roads and light rail transport systems were also accelerated in order to be completed in time for the Games. The sports facilities that Malaysia now has are world class, and there is no doubt that the city is capable of hosting even the Olympic Games one day. It is a fact that KL has more international class hotels, and they're building some more. I don't know who's going to fill them, but they are building some more. More international class hotels than Athens, as you know, the host for the 2004 Olympics. So where do we go from here? Malaysia will obviously continue to organize major events, whether of a sporting nature or otherwise. The reason is that we have the ability and the facilities to do so. We are capable of delivering a quality event at a low cost and are therefore extremely globally competitive in this regard. We have good weather that is more or less the same period for 12 months of the year, which means that virtually any time is a good time for organizing an event. Visitors feel safe, and believe me, are safe when they visit this country, and the people are warm and friendly. The government, above all, is wholly in support of the tourist industry and encourages organizations such as mine, the Olympic Council of Malaysia, to go out and bid for major international events and provide us with funds for doing that. And the experience of hosting the 1998 Commonwealth Games has certainly changed the mindset of the Malaysian people, as it did for the people of Manchester recently. Today, Malaysia is a more confident nation in terms of its international relations and its place in the world. It feels it can stand shoulder to shoulder with the best in the world. The 1998 Commonwealth Games in KL was certainly a major contributor to this. After 1998, Malaysians never really looked back. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Organizers of